I'm Michelle Woodhite, the designated broker of Best Choice Realty. We are doing our Monday night series, and we're talking about tonight the practicing of law. Many of you are getting super creative, and if you're listening to this after today, I'm sure we will talk about this. It'll be the ongoing topic. Every year we have more agents practicing law and writing things up on a Form 34. In Washington, our Form 34 is our blank addendum, and that would be considered practicing law. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation, I've got about 22 to 25 slides that I've put together. Actually, I did not put them together. Shannon, our beautiful operations manager, has put the slides together with the help of our transaction support team. Tara and Jenny are running point on our transaction support, and they have identified some areas of concern that I want to make sure that we've gone over, and ways that we could better, instead of putting it on a Form 34, most of the things we'll talk about tonight are forms or approved attorney language that would be best used instead of using the Form 34 in the fashion that you're kind of getting creative. So we'll go through kind of slide by slide in various scenarios tonight, and I'm sure you'll come up with some questions that you may want to think, is there a form for this, or is there a way to handle this in a better way? It's probably better to call or email or text us than to practice law. So just to jump right in, Form 34, this is taken right from the Northwest MLS. It says under Washington state law, when you're using a Form 34, you should not insert language that is not prepared by an attorney. Anytime you do that, you in essence are practicing law, and you could run the risk that you could run into problems either with your license or with a client, or just having confusion that could be detrimental to the parties or to whom you're representing. So you'll want to make sure that you're using the appropriate notices rather than using a Form 34. And you'll also want to consider using some of the form numbers or the additional help that we provide you at the office level. If you ever have a question, we are here to support you. So having said that, then you guys start to wonder, well, why do we have a Form 34 that's in the transaction desk? And this is an example of one that we have used an attorney approved language, and it is available for you to use in transaction desk. It's labeled BCR Form 34, and it's labeled Septic, hold harmless. And this is the language that we would advise you to use if you are running into some difficulties with your septic system and going through the various points of checkpoints that the county wants you to go through, and yet your parties want to close the transaction. We don't want to be liable, and we want to have some sort of appropriate language in the case of a septic system that is not, maybe has deficiencies or maybe has issues with it, where the county will not sign off on that particular situation. And so we do need to draft some attorney approved language to allow the parties to close, despite the issues that we had with the septic. This would be an example of that, where we are using a Form 34, but it is attorney approved language on this Form 34. The first thing that you'll notice is it's quite lengthy. Most attorneys are not short. They don't write in concise language. They like to use a lot of attorney-esque language. So this is an example of, I kept our attorney to one page, and that was difficult. This took 3 drafts to get it to this point where we had to work with I just said, I just need 1 page in practice. That's what we're looking for. And she complied. So this would be an example of a Form 34 that was attorney approved language that you can use. But there are many times that our transaction support team will see you guys, and maybe it's not you. I will preface it. It's probably more so the other agent from the other company that's writing the language, but we need to get clarity on who wrote the language, and we need to notate the file because we are audited. Just right now, we're being audited in 2 branch locations, and that comes up all the time when they're looking at our files and they're looking to see, well, who drafted this Form 34? And I have to go back to the respective agent and ask, was that Tara that drafted it, or was it Shannon that drafted it? Sometimes we don't know. We have to get clarity on that. So with something like this, we know it's been approved by our attorney, and I could clearly say on such and such a date, our attorney went ahead and approved this language that went on the Form 34. So there would be some sort of level of scrutiny placed on that attorney for that language. Here's an example of an earnest money non-refundable. We don't want to use earnest money non-refundable. We see this all the time, every single week in our file reviews that we do with my support team and with me. We find at least 1 to 3 of these written per week. So we are still seeing this done a lot in King County most of the time, where it's improperly written. It says EM, sometimes they even write EM. Most people don't know what EM is. On the interest of time and on the slide, we put EM, but that earnest money stands for, EM stands for earnest money. But this example is placed on a 22D other. So this would be another instance that would be practicing law. That's why they didn't give us very much space on the 22D other section to write, because they don't want us practicing law. But even though we have just a small little snippet of space in term 12, we still see brokers writing, a buyer agrees to make the earnest money of $100,000 non-refundable and make it early release to the seller. That's not very good language, because it does not say it's applicable to the purchase price and all of the rest of the language that we have approved on our Form 34 earnest money non-refundable. This also is available on Transaction Desk for you to use. If you don't want to use a Form 34, you can use the Best Choice Realty additional clauses. It also is vetted language that's on that particular form. But just like the other Septic Form 34 that I've had the attorney approve, we also have approved the language for the Form 34 here in this format as well. So we should not be seeing 22D other, that section. If you do see something like this, say that you are representing the seller and you didn't write this language, that was the buyer's agent that maybe was not trained properly, then you want to counter them, cross that off, and use the Form 34 that we have had with this approved by the attorney. In essence, it's the same thing. I know the intent of the parties, but again, it's not properly worded. And it could be a problem if you get under contract and now we have to deal with $100,000 of earnest money that's in dispute. We don't want to have that happen. That could mean that you might not get paid, or you might have to give up commission. We don't want to have that happen. So use the forms that we've provided you and make sure that they are approved language that goes on the Form 34. So throughout the rest of the slides that we have tonight, there's an X by what we saw, what Tara or Jenny brought to my attention, with the appropriate what you should have done. So it's kind of like the good, bad, and ugly that we've done in the past. Bad would be buyer's broker will contribute 0.5% of the purchase price from the commission toward the buyer's closing cost. So in essence, basically what happened during the negotiation is it sounded like the buyer's broker wanted to contribute commission. Now we can do that at Best Choice Realty. We do allow for those types of instances to occur. However, it needs to be approved by the firm. The commission is earned by the companies or by the firm. It's not done between buyers, brokers, or buyers agents. That's not the way commission is allocated. So it needs to be properly dispersed and approved on a Form 40, just like below. The language that many of you ask me, and I catch a lot of you doing this and it's not approved, where it says credit to buyers towards allowable closing costs and prepaids. We never do put the buyer's name on there and then put the buyer's home address. I kind of chuckle when I see it come across, but there are people that are doing that and it's not appropriate. There's people that are trying to avoid taxes and that type of thing. And it's all done correctly with escrow when we do it on the Form 40 as outlined here below. So it says 10,000 to Best Choice Realty with our address, so the check gets cut appropriately, and 5,500 is a credit to buyer's closing costs, or a credit to buyer at closing. That would be the appropriate verbiage that's placed on the Form 40. Next slide. This one is also done improperly. This was the Form 34 that we saw a few weeks ago, where it says the seller to pay compensation to agent representing her, the seller, closing, and we put the name, 3% of the selling price, seller to pay compensating agent representing buyer, 3% of the selling price. Also another instance where if we're trying, and this was off market, so I can see where the agent was thinking, there's not a form for this, or maybe they just didn't know there was a form for this. So we want to make sure that we get compensated. That's at least the right, we do have to have something in writing. So that was the right thought process. However, we do have two different forms that address compensation for instances of off market. So either Form 47, where we represent the seller, where we need to agree to compensation, that would be the appropriate format to use rather than use a Form 34, or we use a Form 41C that addresses compensation when we represent the buyer. So in either the seller, where we represent the seller, or the buyer, in both of those instances where we're doing it off market, there is an appropriate form. We should not be using a Form 34. So in this instance, I believe we spoke with the agent and we made those appropriate changes just so we were clear and we didn't have any problems with the buyer and the seller not understanding what it was really going toward. So we did have to use and change out that format. Next slide. Next slide, Shan. There we go. The cover letters and summary. So I see some brokers, not our brokers, we actually do a pretty good job, but on this one, instead of using a summary like in an email, this broker got a bit creative and said that the offer price is $845, even though the purchase price was $845 on the first page of the purchase and sale agreement, escalation clause to $855. It's almost like they put those highlights that would be on a cover letter and put those on a Form 34. So again, we're seeing all kinds of creativity out there. And creativity, when it comes to practicing law, this could be seen as a discrepancy. It could be seen as the agent practicing law. Escalation clause. What is an escalation clause? How is that played? Does that modify the Form 35E? Oftentimes it does when you put a Form 34 together. So this would be an instance where a Form 34 could be seen as basically overriding what you already had in a purchase and sale agreement. So much better plan would be to use an offer summary letter that just clearly says, hello, Mike, has maybe the key points of the offer that you want to highlight, but in essence, it's not considered part of the contract like a Form 34 would be considered. Next slide. This one, Form 34 up on the top here of the slide, it says the seller agrees to contribute $7,000 at closing toward buyer's closing costs. Buyer hereby waives Form 35 inspection contingency. This one, if I was to weight it and say, is this as bad as some of the other Form 34s? Certainly not as bad as the last one we just looked at, but it certainly be better to put anything that's called a waiver, giving the waivers on the appropriate notices. So if we are going to write a waiver into the contract, we should be using, if we're writing an offer, we should be using the 35W rather than writing on number 2, buyer hereby waives the Form 35 inspection contingency. We should be using the 35W or advising that the client or the buyer's agent that wrote the offer on our listing uses the appropriate forms, uses the 35W if that's what they're trying to, in essence, do. Also, if let's say it's already mutual and there was a Form 34 that was negotiated between the parties, would this hold out? I can see it being okay because of $7,000 at closing toward buyer's closing costs. However, they're missing a very important phrase. It could be allowable. It should see seller agrees to contribute $7,000 towards buyer's allowable closing costs. So just a simple word calling allowable could kind of create a lot of confusion for not only the lender, but also the buyer and the seller who have agreed to this. So it's better to go ahead and use the appropriate forms like the language that's in the 22A. I would have probably helped the buyer's agent if they would have come to me in providing the appropriate language to write that into a Form 34 that in essence would have been the similar language like we have written on the 22A. Or in the cases of the inspection, we would want to use a 35R. So this is another example of a 35R. So instead of writing this on a 35R, this agent instead used a Form 34 addendum. So I guess, they thought they were doing the right thing because it says addendum to 35R. I mean, I would say maybe give them a point there for at least referring on Form 34, referring to the 35R. Many people don't refer to that, and then it becomes very confusing. But with 1, 2, 3, those 3 items, I can tell you right now, I have done many 35Rs in my career in negotiating inspection repairs, and all 3 of those items would have fit on the 35R. If you can go back a half a step, Shannon, you can see the 35R. I know they don't give you a lot of space to write on the 35R down below, but it's certainly enough space to fit there's enough space that would fit on that 35R, and that would be the left side of the bottom of the page there. Okay. So definitely we want to take that language. And the reason for that is because when you do a 34, there is no response timeline. If I had written this instead of doing a 35R, what that means is we have to reflect on the contract on the Form 35 to understand when things have to be done by, where the 35R is referenced in the contract, and there are timelines that are associated with doing the responses for seller to respond and buyer to respond. So by taking it off the grid and putting on a Form 34, in essence, you're practicing law, and there's a computation of time back and forth that can be very confusing for either the buyer's agent or the listing agent to deal with. So that's why we don't want it done like that. Keep it on the 35R, negotiate on the 35R, rather than taking it off and putting it on the Form 34. 35, not satisfied, you want to check the box, and then that's, it's done. If the 34, a lot of people say, well, Rochelle, I don't want to have the lender, we're negotiating, on some things that I don't want the lender to know about. I mean, that's a kind of lender fraud, really. When you think about what you're trying to do there, you want to try to keep it on the 35R. The lenders do not get a copy of the 35R. And if you do a 34, the lenders should be getting a copy of the 34, because anything that's a 34 or an addendum to the purchase and sale agreement, the lender needs to get a copy of any of the 34. So extension, credits, purchase price adjustments that may be on a Form 34 or an adjustment that needs to be made, the lender needs a copy of the 34. They don't get a copy of the 35R. So you can have those exchanges back and forth in negotiation that does not get sent to the lender. That's another reason why you don't want to put it on a 34. Another purchase and sale change, there's another one that is on the top that's a no-no. It's washer and dryer do not convey. Title and escrow to be with WFG. Closing date to be June 29th. Form 65B, rental starts here, first month there. Again, there's a lot of missing information on the top portion that could be addressed, not only with the they put the 22D, that would be where you would write the washer and dryer. So you can see all of that stuff. The excluded items seller shall repair any damage to the property caused by the removal of that. Nowhere does that say that in the Form 34 and the top section. And we did have a problem where the washer and dryer, it says do not convey, but they took the washer and dryer out, dismantled the connection, and now we have damage that we've done to the property before closing. We had to do an extension. It was a mess. So to avoid that, you definitely want to make sure you're using the appropriate forms. Also, with rental agreements, we have a lot of problems with rental, people doing rent backs, people not understanding. If we did not have the first month, second month, all of that properly displayed in the rental agreement, it's like leaves a lot to be desired. We don't know what is intended by the parties, and we're kind of at a loss as to kind of guess what the parties were thinking about, where it would have been described on the Form 65B here. It would have been described on where the rent, who it was payable to, when it started, what was the term, when was the move out, what was the second month, how was the occupancy done? All of that is described here in the 65B. So don't try to write your own 65B on a Form 34. That's a total no-no, especially in the instances where we're dealing with the aftermath of COVID and tenants and landlords not getting along so well when it comes to that ending date or that term. It's much better to have an actual approved, attorney-approved form or a language that can address instances like rent backs or 65A or B, depending on what your situation is. Additional buyers to the contract. This comes up a lot. I've got mom and dad. I mean, as the prices start to go up, we're going to probably start to see the need for adding additional purchasers to the contract. The MLS, Northwest MLS, has done a great job of getting ahead of a lot of these things before they start to occur. So back in 2017, we started to see the rise of additional purchasers, mom, dad, actually the other way around, son and daughter buying houses for mom and dad going on the loan or assisting with or putting themselves on the contract. In those instances where you have more than two parties meaning buyers buying, maybe it's mom, dad, and then the son goes on. You could add the son very simply by adding a 22Z and having that sent over to the lender and to the parties because it's initialed and signed by both buyer and seller, where we add buyer on this section, Mr. 2 buyer, we just document, we put it together. This was a dummy one that we put together. So in this instance, instead of having all of those members of those family on a Form 34, we should have had all the members of the family agree to the 22Z, signing their full status and their signatures so that we could verify the signatures and doing it correctly. The Form 34 was not sufficient in this case, and we needed to make sure that we had proper disclosure on this particular format. I can tell just from the top of the form on the no-no, that was somebody else from another company who drafted this Form 34, not one of our brokers. But in this instance, let's help our colleagues at those various firms and counter back and have them fill out the 22Z. Many of them have not been trained that the Form 22Z even exists. So you can use the forms, and that's much better. Keeping it moving, Shannon's keeping me moving tonight to make sure we have enough time to get through all of the Form 34 mishaps. We have the 22Z in this instance and the 22Y. This agent wanted to do an extension, but also add some additional purchasers. When this happens, usually there's some sort of issue with the loan. So you, as a listing agent, you kind of want to, that's a red flag. Kind of think about that. If you were the listing agent here and you got a Form 34 that asked for the closing date to be extended or modified, and then all of these additional purchasers, that might be a red flag where you might want to negotiate not only an extension, but also negotiate a financing waiver. So that was a clue for me that we probably want to use a 22Y. Definitely put the modification of the closing date on there correctly. Other dates, that's where we want to instead of saying earnest money non-refundable, we'd want to write the full earnest money approved language, and also maybe want it to waive the financing contingency, just so that it's clear by the parties. And then we want to probably put the 22Z in addition, 22Z to be added to the contract, and then have the appropriate people sign. That all would be something that, again, it takes a lot of knowledge and experience to see a lot of cancellations that occur, or a lot of extensions, or a lot of disruption between the parties to know these types of things. But I would just say on the surface, if I was new to the business, no, when you start adding all these people, you got to use the right form, and definitely use the 22Y for extensions or modifications in the closing date. Okay, next slide. Another one on the extension. Closing shall take place on or before May 6, 2022. I love this one. They got really creative. They said, ideally, closing shall take place on April 29th. So what is it? Is it April 29th or is it May 6th? Like, what are we really trying to get to here? So what should have been done is 22Y, and we put the April 27th, 2022. Now, I'm not so rigid to think that we negotiate by putting on or before, but attorneys hate that when we do that, because some of the clauses that are written into the contract, such as walkthroughs or pre-inspection or checking things out, if you put April 27th, 2022, and you put on or before, some of those contingencies that are impacted in the contract, they don't make sense because you put on or before. So you got to think about that when you're drafting this type of language, even on the 22Y, is, do I want to confuse the parties, or do I want to just keep it a nice, hard, fast extension, or a nice, hard, fast closing date? When you're dealing with a lot of chaos in the middle of a transaction and parties are unglued and there's walkthroughs taking place and there's inspections, I've had some pretty crazy ones. You'll want to make sure that you have a firm date on your 22Y. Don't be messing around with on or before, because then it becomes very confusing for walkthroughs and inspection checks on some of that. Changing lenders. This happens a lot. A lot of you are starting to use Form 34s to do that. There is a form for that. The new closing date shall be April 29th, 2022 or sooner. Again, I'd rather have you just put that on 22Y. Seller and listing agent agreed to allow the buyer to switch lenders. I don't know when the listing agent's really a party to the contract in that way. So that would be not appropriate to write that type of language. But I think the intent of the parties was to basically allow for the 22AC, which is the form that you would use to agree to change lenders, and both the buyer and the seller initial that form, and that form gets communicated and put into the transaction file. Nowhere does it make the listing agent a party to a finance dispute, or a finance 22AC, or a finance contingency. I don't remember any time, unless the listing agent was owner as well. I don't see where that would make sense with that language. But nonetheless, we had an instance where that occurred, and that was a Form 34 that we reviewed. So switching lenders, always, there's a form for that. And I think you can guess the theme tonight. There's a form for that. Most likely, instead of using a Form 34, there's a form for that. There most likely is a form for any type of situation that you are thinking about drafting. There's a form for that. Another one, there's a form for that. In fact, you probably just didn't remember where it was placed. But if convenient, I like this. This is like, oh, this is a feel good. The sellers do not have to clean the property again prior to closing, and the buyers are happy to take care of any items the seller may leave or not want to deal with. Again, this is an agent putting into words probably what her buyer wanted her to put into, or him. I guess I won't blame the women in this group. But if convenient, the sellers do not. So again, we're practicing law. We're trying to put in words what our buyer has wanted us to do. Anytime we're asked by a buyer to put something in writing like this, our response to that buyer is, I'll go ahead and write that on a Form 34, but I want you to be aware that you should seek legal help to draft this type of language, because I can't be practicing law. That's not my job. There's usually a form for that. And there is, in this instance, if the agent would have called one of my transaction support team or myself, or texted me and said, Rochelle, hey, my buyer wants to kind of have some negotiation about cleaning the property, I would have told them that it's covered in 22D. Not checking that box makes that not applicable, and the sellers do not have to clean the property in that way. And the buyers are happy to take care of any items the seller may leave. That would be checking box number 4. So it'd be unchecking box number 3 and checking box number 4 on the 22D. That would be the proper way to communicate what you're trying to do on a Form 34. And if we need to get the buyer on board or have a conference call or make sure that they're aware that that's in the contract, then we do that instead of practicing law and writing it on a Form 34. I think we're getting close to the end, right, Shannon?
We're almost there.
Almost there. Okay. This one's a waiver of financing, but so this agent got creative and thought, okay, I want to write this in because the lender's appraisal, I need to get them access. I need to get that lender to allow, the lender's going to have to get an appraisal on the property, but we're waiving the financing contingency, but we need to have the buyer's lender get access to do their appraisal. That's very common in the Northwest MLS, as they got ahead of this back a few years ago. And in the modification of the forms, went ahead and placed it on the 22EF, Form 22EF. So just like I said before, there's a form for that. There's a section, Shannon even highlighted it for you so you can draw your client's attention to it. It says, if buyer disclosed that the buyer is obtaining a loan, which we did by using the Form 22EF, the seller shall permit an appraisal of the property and the inspections required by the buyer or the lender, including but not limited to heating, plumbing, roof, electrical, wall inspections, and that would include appraisals as well. Seller is not obligated to pay for these types of things unless otherwise agreed. So instead of writing your own language, the Form 22EF had it already there, already listed, and the parties are already agreeing to it when they sign off on this. It's definitely very confusing when you write this, although there's some points I like on it. It's definitely something that I can tell was written by a buyer's agent, not an attorney. Let's go to the next one. Low appraisal. Yes, we are seeing low appraisals. We're seeing actually more of those. So if you are a listing agent, continue to negotiate and request 22 ADs. But this agent, buyer agrees to waive off. Okay, waive off is not an approved language. Waive off appraisal contingency, but only if the appraisal comes in not more than $60,000 lower than the contracted price. All the while, the buyer's agent's practicing law. They should have been using a 22 AD. If you are receiving an offer like this on one of your listings, you may want to counter by using the appropriate form and just removing the Form 34 where it says buyer agrees to waive off appraisal contingency if the appraisal comes in not more than $60,000 lower than the contracted price. You may want to advise that they either remove their financing and appraisal contingency altogether, which is basically what that would say in the Form 34, or use approved language. There's not approved language for this. They would have to get with an attorney to draft that language or use a 22 AD. So there is a form for that, but it's kind of like they're pre-negotiating something that is not more than 60,000 lower than the contracted price. It's working with the purchase price rather than if the appraisal, it's kind of like a backwards way of thinking about it. The only time I've seen this happen is when they have got approved attorney language to draft that. This is definitely not drafted by an attorney. So I think we got through, last one, seller financing. You are going to start to see as the market starts to correct in some areas that we operate in, you may start to see where buyers will try to see if the sellers will finance. And there are instances where we are doing that with business opportunities where sellers are financing part of the purchase price, or the buyer's unable to get financing for this particular interesting property that's it's like cash, but then if we could carry some of the contract price, the seller might do it. Any instance like that where a seller's carrying part of the contract, seller is paying or in essence financing part of that contract, there is a form for that. It's Form 22C, C as in cat. And the form is right here. And again, if you look at the instructions on the 22C, it is actually telling us to proceed with caution because we are not lenders. And there are provisions on how you fill that out where the buyer or the seller should seek legal counsel in knowing which one would benefit them and which one would hurt them. We are not advised to act as lenders, nor do we have the skill set to be a lender. Some of us are. We're duly licensed to do loans, licensed to do real estate transactions. But in this instance, 22C comes with a caveat, meaning that if we are going to be doing a 22C, that the buyer and seller understand that they should have an attorney look it over. It's already built into that contract. So by practicing law here, there's nowhere that it says that the buyer or seller should seek legal help. It's just clearly saying the seller is financing a private loan. That's a no-no as well. We need to make sure that we're using the appropriate forms. I think I got it through. I knew it was going to be tough, Shannon. Thank you for keeping me on pace. But I will open it up. Tara, did I miss anything or did I need to get some more clarity on any of that? She reviews a lot of the stuff and kind of brings it to my attention. So
no, I think you got most of them.
Okay. And I try to be selective. I know I've covered some of the others that we've seen on some of the inspection and some of the other financing calls that we've had in the past. But let's just open it up if there's any questions too.
The only one that wasn't clear is I think some people are using the 34 for the 36.
Oh, the good point. Thank you for bringing that up. And you should be using, if you're going to counter, you should be using a 36, not a 34. And that can be very confusing for people. If you send a 34 and you're in the middle of negotiations, use a 36, not a 34. Or, cross off the appropriate points and initial, and that would be counter offering as well. So you either have two choices when you're making a counter. You have in Washington, you can cross things off and make sure all the parties initial, or you can use a Form 36. It's one or the other. It's not using a Form 34. Thank you for bringing that
Rochelle, can you hear me?
Yes, Lynette.
Okay, so I was the one on that last one, the form about seller financing, and I did fill out the Form 22C, and the escrow, which is escrow and title, they also have a loan servicing department, and they're doing the loan for the seller and the buyer. And they were the one that kept coming back with, spell out the payment and spell out the term.
Really?
Yeah. And so I haven't done too many of them, but the ones I have done, they never told me to keep, spelling out more in detail of what's going on, because I thought these forms did cover it.
They do cover it. I mean, when I matched it up, Lynette, I matched it up. It matched up just fine. That's why it's kind of curious why they had you do that.
They said, one thing they said was it didn't state that it was a balloon payment in 10 years, that it was amortized over 30, but due in 10. So I don't know if that's not on this form or what, but that was one of them. So, because they said I don't know, they just said the payment would be a lot higher if it's due in 10 years with not being amortized over 30 years. So I guess
Okay.
it made it look like it was a 10-year loan is what it
I
looked like.
see.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, the parties initialed it, then that becomes part of the contract. In that case, you had a 22C in addition to the Form 34, but I used yours as just an example to show
Yeah.
that we are starting to see more of that, right? When we start to get some creative types of financing situations, and some of the property types won't finance, and so we have to ask the seller to carry or finance.
Yeah.
And just to be careful on that. But yes, the 22C does cover balloons. It does cover amortization.
Yeah.
And it's weird that they had you to cover yourself, do it twice.
I used to do loan servicing years ago, but anyway, I did, I told the escrow and the buyer and seller, when you go in and sign your documents, you go introduce yourself to the loan servicing department, because
Right.
you're working with them on a monthly basis. So.
Right. No, it's great. Thank you for bringing that up. Anything else? Shannon, anything else that came through on your text line?
No, I think we're great. So I know we covered a lot really quickly, but I hope everybody found that super helpful. And there's a form for that, truly. For any type of circumstance that you have in mind that you're going to come across, there is something that you can look for, especially in the notices when you start thinking about backing out or responding to certain things or contingencies. There's usually some sort of form for that. So
Okay.
yeah, thanks, Rochelle.
All right. You guys have a great week. Next week, we'll cover another topic. Looking forward to